minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast from 3CR in Melbourne, broadcast live. This program is going around Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano, and if you're wondering what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers, it's about creating a society without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, whether it's Russia or the United States of America or China or even little old Australia. It's the same thing. Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power, share power, possibly through direct democratic means. It's the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Motherhood statements. So all those people who think that anarchy is chaos, think again. What is more chaotic than having rulers, whether they're self-appointed or elected, make decisions for all of us? I mean, if you want to talk about chaos, look at what's happened in the world in the past few years. Mass murder in Gaza, mass murder in Ukraine, the list goes on and on. All right, let's move on. I'm interested in looking at a new phenomenon. Well, it's been happening for a number of years, but it's been under the radar, but it's exceptionally important. Now, we've seen privatisations privatise institutions, and we're all aware of that and the negatives of that. As governments at the state and federal level in this country privatise community assets, privatise assets which have been built up through the efforts of millions of people over decades. But what we're seeing now is the next phase of privatisation, and that's privatising public servants. I'm not saying they sell them on an open market like slaves, but in many regards they do. Now, when you go to a public facility, there's not many public facilities left. There's public schools, there's public hospitals, public roads. There's not much left. Most things have been privatised. What we're seeing is the privatisation of labour, which is being provided by public servants for the good of the country. This is very relevant in the public hospital sector. And I'm not talking about public-private partnerships. What I'm talking about is the efforts by governments, especially state governments as far as health is concerned, to outsource essential components of the public health system to the private sector. And what we see is workers who's devoted 10, 20, 30 years of their lives are then relocated to a labour hire company which puts them on casual rates and then rehire, and then the hospitals, and then it provides that labour back to the hospitals. Now, in most public hospitals in Victoria, you will see that this has occurred to some degree, but because of the current financial situation in Victoria, we've seen a huge push by the state government to actually privatise as many of the public servants as possible. Now, we saw this at the federal level where the Defence Ministry, half of the workers of the Defence Ministry were basically consultants or people who were provided by private labour hire firms. But we're talking about people who do essential services in the hospital system. Cleaners, kitchen staff, ward help, wards people, and the list goes on and on. Porters, and we've seen in major public hospitals, and one I'm aware of is the Alfred Hospital, is the fact that most of the workers who provide essential services but may not have any university qualifications like doctors or paramedical staff and nurses now find that they are employed as casuals by labour hire firms who have bought the right to use these people's labour. So currently, in the eastern divisions of the public hospital sector in Melbourne, there is this struggle going on by members of the Health Workers Union regarding the privatisation of workers there who provide essential services. Now, in many regards, these are false types of savings because you don't actually see the cost involved from the state government or the federal government on the balance sheet. But what it does, it changes the nature of the balance sheet. So when the accountancy goes on at the end of the year, people can say, oh, there's been savings in this particular area when there haven't actually been savings. But the major impact is on one, services which are provided, because what happens once these public service jobs in the hospital sector especially are outsourced to a private firm, you find the private firm tries to maximise its profits by reducing staff, which reduces services to people in the public hospital sector. And just as importantly, what we see is workers who had had job security, no longer have job security and no longer have access to many of the benefits they enjoyed as public servants when they worked in the hospital sector because they're put on casual rates. So this is the next step in the privatisation nightmare. Privatising public service. Privatising the functions public servants provide. And we've seen it in the Commonwealth Employment Services. We've seen it in the Defence Ministry. We've seen it's not just about outside contractors coming in. It's about people who do the actual day-to-day work being outsourced to private companies to provide a service to the population at large. And this is something that really needs to be resisted because that's the problem. It's a central issue. It really needs to be resisted at all levels. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, Mr. Barnaby, I think you know Mr. Barnaby, ex-Deputy Prime Minister, ex-Leader of the National Party by two, ex-National Party member, is now joining Divided Nation. Isn't it interesting? Now, a lot of people kind of use the word One Nation, but I can't bring myself, I can't bear to think of using the word One Nation because they're not one nation. They're about creating a divided nation. Now, it's interesting that as I get older and that I think Pauline gets older, they're looking around for some type of figure to give some legitimacy to Divided Nation. And Divided Nation is doing very well at the minute electorally. It's got 4 senators, and with Barnaby in the lower house, I'm not sure if he's going to be a member of just as an independent or whether he's actually going to be be a member of the Divided Nation, which would give them 5 seats then in Parliament, which makes them a registered political party as far as the parliamentary goodies are concerned. But the fact is that whatever you think about Mr. Barnaby Joyce, he has never really taken on many of the divisive policies that are part and parcel the bread and butter of divided nation. The way divided nation is growing, it's going to be the Greens of the conservative forces. Like the Greens split the vote as far as the Labor Party is concerned. It looks like there's an increasing number of Australians who feel totally isolated, disenfranchised and marginalised, who are putting their support to divided nation because they think that somehow that it's the other in society that has stolen their job, stolen their children's future, ensured that they'll continue to live a marginal existence. See, the problem with groups like Divided Nation is it's very simple to point the finger at the other and lay blame on the other. It's a much more difficult enterprise, as we found with public interest before corporate interest, to lay the blame where it lies. And to a significant degree, Australians find themselves in the situation we find ourselves in, where we have 2 million children living in poverty, we have about one third of the population living on social security benefits, and another 60% finding themselves spending most of their income, up to 40% of their income, on mortgage repayments and rent. The fact is that for far too long, there have been too many people willing to accept what seem to be simple solutions to their problems. Stop the migrants, put them all in jail, deport them, etc., etc. But the fact is that is not the central problem which is faced by us as a community. And that central problem is inequalities in power and wealth, and the growing inequalities in power and wealth. As political parties, which theoretically represent the interests of Australians, represent the interests of that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% that make up part of the investment class in this society. So we see as people become disenfranchised and marginalised that they're looking for scapegoats. And it's very easy to point your finger at somebody who's got a different religion, speaks a different language, wears funny clothes as far as you're concerned. It's much easier to do that and exploit that, as Divided Nation does, than actually looking at the real reason we find ourselves as a people in this particular situation. It's all very good saying, we don't want Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to have a voice, in federal parliament, a voice in the Constitution. It's very simple to run a negative campaign and defeat a referendum. But it's much more, and it's very simple to point the finger at the other, the person who looks different, as I said before. But it's much, much, much harder to look at the essential problem, to join the dots, to find out why a country as rich as Australia finds itself in a situation where many of its citizens and permanent residents lead a hand-to-mouth existence. And there are 4 major issues which has faced us for the last half a century. And those major issues have been compounded by the fact that major political parties have now been captured by the very people who exploit us. And those major political parties now basically sing from the same song sheet as the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And we see it week after week, day after day, year after year. And obviously, in a society that claims it's democratic, you will see people move away looking for simple solutions to their problems. And if there are political parties like Divided Nation which offers simple solutions, then you are more likely to accept a simple solution than actually look a little bit deeper. Now, on every available statistical indicator in the last 50 years, we've seen the richer grow richer, the poorer grow poorer, and the powerful grow more powerful. All you've got to do is cast your eye around the place, and we don't talk about millionaires anymore. They're just a dime a dozen. We talk about billionaires and possible trillionaires. So, what's the way forward? The way forward is to expand the debate. Now, I've noticed the divided nation is creating more and more branches across the country as people look for simple solutions. Now, obviously, there are political parties out there. Most of these political parties are either issue-orientated, which means that they're not taking up the interests of the majority of people in this country, or they're welded to the system. So I'm encouraging you to look at public interest before corporate interests. This is a political party that's not about division. It's not about creating a divided nation. This is a political party that wants to put the interests of the many, that's the public, before the interests of the few, and that's the corporate sector. It's not one that promotes division as a solution to the growing inequalities in our society, to the 2 million children living in poverty, to the 1/3 of Australians who, as I said before, live on inadequate social security benefits, and to the other 60% that spend at least 30 to 40% of their income keeping a roof over their heads, whether they're paying off a mortgage or paying rent. The reality is that as long as we allow that small section to dominate every aspect of our existence, we will continue as a people to find ourselves in exactly the same situation. Look, so I encourage you, have a look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest webpage, pibci.net. I'm the current Secretary of Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. It's a reformist group. It's not a revolutionary group. As I said, it's a reformist group. It's about ensuring that the interests of the many are put before the interests of the few, and ensuring that we don't create a divided nation, a nation that's divided on the basis of race or religion, colour, language spoken, nationality, and the list goes on and on. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. Well, I think people are getting used to the buffoon in Washington, the great confabulator. Or I should say the chronic confabulator. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Just extraordinary, the statements we hear from Washington in terms of their interaction with reality. It is just extraordinary. Now, it's not new. We've had such buffoons in the past. I'm talking about people like Mussolini. You know, we've got history of the world is a history full of political, social and cultural buffoons. What they have in common is the fact that they centralise power in their hands. And when you think of a so-called democratic society, one based on a parliamentary system, to have so much power entrenched in the hands of a president is the pathway to extinction. I know it sounds pretty extraordinary, but when you got people in authority who lie consistently, who twist the truth, who refuse to acknowledge the obvious in order to promote their own financial interests, you have a dictatorship. Nothing less, nothing more. Irrespective of whether people are elected into office or not, the fact is they need to work in a parliamentary democracy, under certain constitutional arrangements. I mean, we're not talking about communist China, we're not talking about Putin's Russia. We're talking a society which considers itself to be democratic. And when we as a people, and my great concern is not for the United States, they elected the great confabulator, the buffoon, into power, into Washington, is their problem. But my great concern is the almost slavish way we accept what's happening in Washington and our inability to pursue an independent policy, not just in terms of trades, but in terms of foreign relationships. Because ultimately, if we continue down this path, as I've said on many occasions in the past, we will pay that price. Geographical isolation is no longer protection. For far too long, we have relied on our geographical isolation to protect us from invasion. Attaching ourselves to the United States of America, holus bolus, especially our defence system, our defence forces, which have been totally integrated in the United States Defence Forces, not just in terms of men, but in terms of equipment, is not very smart, not very intelligent, especially when we see the way foreign policy is crafted in this country. Think about it. Think about it. I remember in 1964, it was all the way with LBJ when they entered the Vietnam War, boots and all, and we followed with conscription. I remember the big pictures, on television with the big yellow arrow, the yellow hordes are coming. But the fact is, we do live in Asia. You can't attach tugboats to Australia and, drag it to the west coast of the United States of America. The fact is that we need, as a country, to form relationships with the sovereign nation states around us in order to survive. Our survival is not based on the intermittent protection with the United States of America claims it can provide, as long as we follow their political agenda and as long as we integrate Australian military forces into United States Armed Forces. Just an extraordinary situation to find ourselves at the end of the 21st century. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Now, have you noticed how the Australian media, not just the legacy media, but social media, the new platforms, or now they're old these days, how they tend to pile on to particular subjects which aren't, they're important, but not critical, and how they tend to skirt issues that are critical. Now, a classic example of this is the current hullabaloo regarding the ministerial expenses of the Sports and Communications Minister. Now, obviously, these people aren't stupid, and when they, use taxpayers' money, they do it within ministerial guidelines. These are guidelines which have been passed by Parliament. But what I find extraordinary is the huge pile-on. Now, we're talking about a few $100,000. We're not talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of tax avoidance. We're not talking about growing inequality in this country. Never seems to be any pile-on regarding that. There never seems to be any pile-on regarding the 2 million children living in poverty in this country. There never seems to be any pile-on regarding the fact that public education is grossly underfunded by both state and federal governments. There never seems to be any pile-on when we talk about the growing inequality in this country. But when it's a peripheral issue, and this is a peripheral issue, there's this pile-on. So why is it so? As Professor Julius Sumner Miller would say, to us older listeners, why is it so? Well, it's so because an extraordinary number of the media outlets we have in this country are owned by the private sector, who doesn't want the light to be shone on the fact that 1/3 of this country's corporations paid no tax in the last financial year. It doesn't want the light to be shone on the fact that a handful of corporations are growing rich, gorging themselves on the mineral wealth of this country, while we rely on a peppercorn royalties and peppercorn taxation revenue in order to survive. There's no pile-on about that. But when the issue is peripheral, there's always a pile-on. And I think this highlights the inadequacy of having a media which is government gelded as far as the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is concerned, and which was owned by a minuscule number of millionaires and billionaires. Because they don't want the light shone on them. It's better to make a hullabaloo regarding what is essentially a peripheral issue. I mean, the way I have seen interviews being conducted and people carrying on regarding the minister is just extraordinary. I would love to see 1% of that media spotlight turned onto the fact that we have a growing inequality in this country, which is having a significant impact on a large number of Australians who are so marginalised and disenfranchised they believe the only way to get ahead is to join or support a divided nation and put the finger of blame on the other. Just extraordinary. And to a significant degree, this pile-on highlights to me, and I'm sure to many listeners, the inadequacies of the media in this country. It's a little bit like the legislative agenda. Now, everybody knows we've got a housing crisis. You know it, I know it, and we've got every solution in the world being put forward. Every imaginable solution bar one. There's money being provided to first home buyers. There's money being provided to people to build stuff. Rules have been bent so you can build more homes. People are talking about decreasing migration. It's becoming a significant issue. But nobody in authority talks about the destruction of the public housing sector in this country. The fact that we're seeing privatisation occur at a rate of knots in the public housing sector. The fact that nobody speaks about the fact that you need competition in a capitalist society. We live in a capitalist society. If the private sector dominates the marketplace, the housing marketplace, all you will see is increases in rents and increases in private housing costs. And that's what we see. And the fact is that unless governments build public housing which provides secure long-term accommodation for people, we will continue to see the problems we have. But again, it's as if the word public housing it's got some type of negative connotation. It doesn't come out of the mouths of the politicians. It's all about social housing, affordable housing, communal housing, you name it, they'll call it. If you want decreased housing prices in this country, if you want increased accessibility, you need to enlarge the public housing sector. And if you don't enlarge the public housing sector, all you will get is increases in rent, increases in dislocation of people at the lower end of income, especially on social security benefits, increase sale of the prices of housing, which means that more and more people are kept out of the market, and if they do get into the market, they're mortgaged for the next 30 to 50 years. I mean, we've got to the situation in this country where you have intergenerational mortgages, where parents leave their mortgage to their offspring to sort out when they die. Extraordinary situation. But again, it's the same issue. There seems to be ideas we talk about and ideas that nobody talks about. And to a significant degree, this has occurred because of the privatisation. And what do I mean by this? In the past, maybe 20 years ago, if there were a tax on public housing, we would see church-aligned groups stepping up and resisting those changes. Today, these groups have been bought out by state governments and federal governments. They've been bought out to such an extent they are now totally reliant on government funding that they receive by providing privatised services to the community. Remember the old Commonwealth Employment Service? Well, that was privatised. And who was the major beneficiary of the privatisation of the Commonwealth Employment Service? It wasn't the unemployed. It's to a significant degree the Salvation Army, which makes billions of dollars from providing Commonwealth Employment Services. It's a bit of a tautology. We see it with other church-based groups. We see it with other so-called community-based group or not-for-profit groups. They have now been incorporated through the privatisation of providing services to the population by successive governments. They have been drawn into that net where they become financially dependent on that revenue for them to survive and prosper. So when you see people involved in a public housing struggle, to a significant degree, it's a small group of people who, for maybe political reasons, ideological reasons, or people who feel threatened, come together. So there is never the degree of, the strength, the solidarity to actually change government policy. Because for far too long, Australians have believed, and the key word is believe, that anything public is bad and everything private is good. It's only the private sector which provides services. Anything that's bad is second rate. And to a significant, anything that's public, I should say, is second rate. And to a significant degree, they're right. And why are they right? And this is where where people need to join the dots. They're right because not enough taxation revenue comes in from that small section that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to provide the basic services which are needed by people who, for a variety of reasons, in the majority of cases through no fault of their own, are not able to participate in the employment because they're too old, they're too young, they may have a disability, they may have a medical issue, and the list goes on and on. So it is a tragedy that we have allowed this to occur, believing that if we allow the private sector to dominate every aspect of our lives, that somehow our lives will improve. Extraordinary. I'll give you another example, which most people don't think of. Now, 20 to 30 years ago, most energy production units were basically publicly owned, right? if we lived in Victoria or Queensland or wherever, you had one state-owned enterprise which provided power, electricity, gas and electricity, and you interacted with that particular government-owned entity. Then we saw the privatisation mania grip the energy sector. And we were told that if we privatise the energy sector, we will somehow decrease energy prices. Well, obviously, nothing could be further than the truth. When you privatise these sectors, what happens is you don't get hundreds of little companies, competing against each other. What you get is a large number of corporations taking over some corporations taking over that particular facility, and there's a lack of competition. For example, when telecom was privatised, it provided, telephone services to the population at large. It was government owned. What we saw is the market was broken up into 2 or 3 corporate sectors. And the lunacy is that one of these sectors, Optus, is actually owned by Singapore superannuation funds, which are owned by the government, which provide services to their elderly, and any profits which are made, which are sent offshore, look after the interests of people in Singapore. I say good luck to them. But the fact is that privatising essential infrastructure and essential services does not solve any issues. It makes it more complex. We now have people that own the generating facilities, people that own the power lines, people that provide you access to the power, and the list goes on and on. And if you think prices have fallen, they haven't. They've actually escalated. And that's what happens when you break down competition in a capitalist society. Prices escalate because the natural endpoint of any capitalist society is the formation of corporations. As small companies are eaten up by bigger companies who become bigger, and we get the ridiculous situation where there is a limited number of virtual platforms which dominate thinking and access to goods in this country. None of them are publicly owned, and the fact is there's exceptionally little competition between them, and we see the creation of billionaires, overnight billionaires. Just an extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. As I said before, you can sit back and go tut, 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 and, buy another Tats Lotto ticket or do a bit of gambling on the net. Or you can sit back and go, oh, this is terrible. It's the others to blame. That person who speaks that language or wears that funny hat, they're to blame. I'm going to join Divided Nation and, get rid of them and everything will be hunky-dory. Or you can go a step further. You can look at joining organisations which are not about dividing the nation, but which are about ensuring the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication actually do something for the population at large. Now, you're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Tale of Two Constitutions. Now, there was a significant event in Victoria in the last few months, years. It's taken years in the making. We've seen the signing of a treaty by this Victoria's First Nations people and the state government, and we saw in the last 24 hours the state government, as one of its responsibilities, was to issue an apology. Now, this particular legislation regarding the treaty will not take effect till the 1st of May next year. But interestingly, we have the opposition, the Liberal-led opposition, which talks about if they get elected to power, they will tear up the treaty. So I'd just like to look at the constitutional role, because a lot of people are a little bit confused regarding constitutions. Now, we have a federal constitution and we have state constitutions. The difference between a federal constitution and a state constitution is that only the people, that's the electors, can change the constitution federally. And if the constitution needs to be changed, and I think it's only been successfully changed 9 times since Federation 125 years ago, you need a majority of people in a majority of states for that change to be incorporated into the Australian Constitution. Once it's incorporated in the Australian Constitution, it cannot be removed by an Act of Parliament. It can only be removed through a fresh referendum. Now, when we had the voice referendum recently, what we saw was the failure of that proposal. But if it had been accepted, it would have been incorporated in the Constitution, and only the people through a referendum could change it. Now, a lot of people think the Marriage Equality Act, which occurred, I think, about a decade ago, was a referendum. It wasn't a referendum, it was a plebiscite. And what that means is that a future government can, through legislation, repeal that legislation. That's the difference between a plebiscite, which is basically takes account of the views of the people who vote, but doesn't have to accept those views, and a referendum federally, which means those views need to be incorporated in the constitutions if a majority of electors and a majority of states support that constitutional change. So let's go to the state constitution, and I'll hone in on the Victorian state constitution because they've just passed the legislation regarding a treaty which will take effect on the 1st of May next year. Now, the Victorian state constitution is determined by Parliament. It's determined by the political party that has a majority in Parliament. It is not determined by the citizens of Victoria through referendums. In many regards, the treaty which has been woven between the Victorian state government and the Aboriginal community in Victoria is an Act of Parliament. And as an Act of Parliament, it can be repealed by an incoming government through another Act of Parliament. So in many regards, you have no protection in a constitutionally for the formation of that treaty. Now, these are significant differences, and it's important that people understand that they are significant differences, because it is one thing to say you sign a treaty and it's good for eternity or until people change their minds. It's another thing to say that if the government changes, the incoming government, as the Liberal Party has promised Victorians, will tear up any treaty which is come into effect. Now, a lot of people in this country think that the Constitution provides, the federal Constitution provides them with rights. When the Constitution was formulated and accepted by the people of the various colonies at the beginning of the 20th century, or the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, although there was a discussion regarding incorporating a Bill of Rights into the Australian Constitution, the Constitution makers decided not to incorporate a Bill of Rights. Now, you may think you have a right to public assembly. Well, you don't. State governments can limit that right any time they like. You may think that you have a right to freedom of speech. The only right to freedom of speech is the implied right that the High Court found over 20 years ago that you needed freedom of speech to conduct elections. And the list goes on and on. Under the Australian Constitution, you only have 4 rights. One is a trial by jury for a major crime. Another one is freedom of religion. Another one is fair compensation if the state, that's at the federal level, acquires your property. And the fourth one is, you'll love this one, this is my favourite, is one about discrimination. Not about discrimination because of your gender, not discrimination because of your sexual orientation, not discrimination because of your race, not discrimination because of your religious belief. But if you're discriminated against because of the state you live in, and obviously that makes sense when you had 6 colonies having to vote to federate, and obviously they wanted protection that they wouldn't find themselves on the back foot if they are federated. So if I say the people of New South Wales are a bunch of idiots and that they all should, pay $500 million tax a year, the government of New South Wales, to the federal government, well, that's discriminating unless I pass the same legislation for every state. All right, I know it's esoteric, but it's essential. Sometimes what seems to be esoteric forms the backbone of the type of society we live in. And if we don't understand the constitutional arrangements which occur, then we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Let's move on. The Liberal Party. Now, my great specialty, and I do have a specialty, is giving unsolicited advice. That's right, unsolicited advice that people don't want to hear and don't want to consider. It's my contribution to the political, social and cultural debate in this country. And my unsolicited advice to the Liberal Party is to actually look at their policies. Now, they talk about the fact there aren't enough women in the party, there aren't enough gays in the party, there aren't enough young people in the party, and the list goes on and on. But ultimately, the Liberal Party is no longer the Liberal Party of Australia. That's why it's hemorrhaging votes. The Liberal Party has basically been usurped, taken over by a small faction of people who are basically influenced by the Institute of Private Affairs. They like to call themselves Public Affairs. I call the Institute of Private Affairs. Like I call One Nation, Divided Nation. I call the President of the United States a buffoon, the chronic confabulator. The fact is that the Liberal Party no longer represents anybody but a minuscule fraction of the community that wants to move backwards. They have nothing to offer people. The only thing they seem to offer people is more inequality, more oppression. And every time a federal Liberal Party member opens up their mouth, you can actually see that they don't actually have any real policies, and any policies which they agree on, as we saw with the zero emissions by 2050 or 2035, is the fact that it's about opposing legitimate, important changes in the community. Now, my advice to the Liberal Party is to not move to the centre, because the Labor Party's in the centre, but move to the left if they want to get a few more votes. Because the issue is that anybody in the Liberal Party that had any social conscience has left. They are not pre-selected anymore because the branches are dominated by conservative, reactionary elements of society. And if they've got any viewpoints or policies which provide support for the people of this country, they're not pre-selected. And if you look at the current makeup of the Liberal National Party, they're basically a group of people who are still living, who still think that 18th century concepts are important in the 21st century. So what I think will happen, and I hate to say this, that divided nation will make huge inroads into their votes and make them irrelevant unless they're able to reform their branch structure. As I said, unsolicited advice, not the type of thing I expect anybody to take any notice of, but it's a very sad state. But it is a sad state at the end of 2025 when division seems to be the major strategy which is being pursued by an increasing number of political adventurists in this country, because division seems to be paying dividends. And it pays dividends because it acts on people's insecurities. As I said before, the fact is our insecurity isn't due to the other. Our insecurity is due to growing inequality in our society. Our insecurity is due to the domination of our political structures and parliamentary system by vested interests who, through their wealth, are able to ensure that any important legislation to resolve the issues we face as a people never comes up for debate. And if it comes up for debate, what we'll see is a pile-on, that's right, a pile-on, by conservative reactionary elements in society claiming that any change will create chaos. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscana. You can email me at info@anarchistmedia.org, info@anarchistmedia.org, or info@pibci.net. YouTube channels, public interests before corporate interests. josephtoscana.num. That's a historical YouTube channel you can access. I even answer letters. You can write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. The year is drawing to a close. Next year is going to be a particularly difficult year. It's important we maintain our rage, because the fact is we are going to need that rage to survive 2026 as we see more and more people join Divided Nation, as we see more and more people take up ideas that divide us as a nation, and as we see more and more people focusing on identity politics and not focusing on the fact that we live in a society of growing inequality where the 1% own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. Listen to The Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station next week, and get yourself thinking about what you'd like to do for 2026, because we need to organise, we need to come together, because as I said before, it's a particularly difficult year everybody faces. Thank you once again for listening to the anarchist world this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.